global education and global learning for a just, for a peaceful, and for a sustainable world has, of course, a vision of the future, a future of a just, peaceful, and sustainable world. And this is the future education should have in mind. But having this in mind, how should then education look like? And what are then the futures of education? And we are extremely delighted to have, for this question of futures of education, a keynote by Dr. Sobhi Tawil. Sobhi Tawil directs the Future of Learning and Innovation team at UNESCO here in Paris. So we are at your home in a way, right? And Sobhi has an extremely broad working experience in different universities in Morocco, Switzerland, and different positions in UNESCO. His publications cover a wide range on topics of global citizenship education. And of course, there could be no person who represents better the perspective of futures of education. So, Dr. Tawil, the floor now is yours.
So I would like to focus on the transforming. And really, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some thoughts on the current mobilization around transforming education. And I'll be doing that from the vantage point of global education policy, being here at the headquarters of UNESCO and very much involved over the last year and a half, 2 years in that process. And first to say that the language of transforming is new, developed really over the last 10 years, even less perhaps. If one recalls the Millennium Development Goals framework and even the EFA movement, while it was broader, had a focus really on primary education, on meeting the basic learning needs of children, youth, and adults, and therefore a focus initially on access, and then also on quality of basic education, equity in access to basic quality education, I would say, and the language of the global learning crisis captures these challenges in access and quality of basic education, and challenges that remain very much with us. But that framing until 2015 left very little space for considerations around the relevance of education and broader societal outcomes of education. There were no considerations around the transformation of education, and even less for transformative education, understanding that as a fundamental change in the way we think and act individually and collectively. Perhaps the introduction in the global policy discourse of concern with relevance started just prior to 2015, with at the time what was called the Global Education First initiative of the then Secretary General of the United Nations, where they added, in addition to these concerns for access and quality of basic education, a third dimension of fostering global citizenship. And I quote here from the aims. It's interesting to see this in 2012, that the aim of the initiative was to spur a global movement to put quality, relevant, and transformative education at the heart of social, political, and development agendas. Since then, We have seen the language of transformation of education, but also transformation of, or transforming our futures, introduced in a series of key UN documents, framework documents, to begin with the 2015 Sustainable Development Agenda, called Transforming Our World. This was followed just recently in 21 with the report of the UN Secretary General, Our Common Agenda, which proposed a longer-term vision, and which announced the Transforming Education Summit of last year, as well as the reports of the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which was proposed as a key reference for that process. So last year, 2022, the Transforming Education Summit process, probably the most significant mobilization of the international education community in recent years. The summit in September brought together some 2,000 education stakeholders. Heads of states, heads of governments were invited by the UN Secretary General to conduct national consultations on transforming education, and over 130 countries submitted what they call national statements of commitment to transform education. And now we see, just ahead of the Summit of the Future, which is planned for next year, that one of the policy briefs being developed is again framed around transforming education. So that's one about just the introduction of the language of transformation in the global policy discourse. But from there, the second point would be to say that despite the shift and despite the mobilization around the Transforming Education Summit process, much of the discussion and much of what of the actions being proposed are more about reform and incremental change than about transformation. They're largely about doing more of the same, doing business as usual, a kind of reinforcement or a recommitment to what is. And the International Commission on the Futures of Education was clear, however, last June at the pre-summit here in Paris, before this major summit in New York, on how transforming education is to be understood. And I quote here from the statement that the International Commission put out: transforming education means going beyond reforms and improve our education systems and our educational practices. Rather than better versions of existing systems, we need education systems that are different from today. So transformation means fundamental changes to educational processes and opportunities. It includes transformative teaching and learning. Transformative education, transformative teaching and learning empowers, and I'm still quoting from the Commission, empowers as it connects people to each other and to the world, exposes them to new possibilities, strengthens their capacities for critique, dialogue, knowledge creation, and action. So here we have a clear definition proposed by the International Commission on the Futures of Education of what transformation of education implies, that it's more than reform, that it's more than incremental change. We see the language permeate the public, the global policy, education policy discourse. And yet, as I said, much of what we see around the Transforming Education Summit process has more to do with strengthening what is, perhaps reforming, but not a critical reconsideration of what needs to change fundamentally in our education systems. And I think there are possibly two explanations for that. And one has to do with the short-term thinking that characterizes international education development efforts. The language of crises and emergencies, whether related to the consequences of armed conflicts, natural disasters, pandemics, most recently the global COVID-19 pandemic. This locks us into a short-term response mode dictated by the urgency of the situation, and that any rethinking and reimagining and critical reflection is seen as almost a luxury and competing with what are more immediate needs. And this language of crisis has been extended to learning, to the global learning crisis, and aggravated by the educational disruption caused by COVID. So this short-term response mindset and time frame sits uneasily with the longer-term thinking that is required for the transformation of education. The two very distinct approaches to analysis and action are actually difficult to combine. But this is what we see in the Transforming Education Summit process. If we look at the rationales of the summit, there were three. This is rationales for the summit on transforming education. The first objective, the first rationale, to help children and young people catch up on learning lost during the pandemic. So here we are in the short term. We're in the emergency response. It's about recovery from learning lost. It's the critical importance of mitigating the impact of the educational disruption on participation, on dropouts, on access to education, participation in and learning outcomes is not to be questioned. But it is a short-term response thinking, and it is a response encouraging return to what was. And this, despite the opportunity that the COVID-19 educational disruption initially provided, despite the tragedy of the health crisis, it did suggest an opportunity to fundamentally rethink our approaches to education and development. So in this recovery, catch up on learning lost during the pandemic, we are really encouraging going back to the models that we had, and it leaves very little space to critically examine what has led us to the global learning crisis in the first place, little consideration for little room for consideration around reform, and let alone transform education. So that first rationale for the Transforming Education Summit process, really around the short-term emergency response. The second rationale, to accelerate progress towards the achievement of Sustainable Development Goal 4. So this is more medium-term thinking, defined by the 2030 timeframe. It's got to do with accelerating progress and getting SDG 4 back on track. So it remains also more focused on the more easily monitored quantitative access, equity, quality targets of the SDG agenda, and much less on the transformative education elements, in particular, as you very well know, the 4.7 of the SDG 4. So the proposals that have come out of that discussion during the test have more to do with strengthening political commitment to education, to more equitable access, to more and better financing of education. But again, very little room for reform, very little space for considerations around the transformation of education systems or around transformative education. So a short-term emergency rationale, a kind of medium-term, let's accelerate progress to SDG 4, and we're looking at a 2030. And a third rationale, and the only one that explicitly mentions the transformation of education. And I cite, to transform education systems so that students reach their full potential. So this transformation of education, this is really the only one of the three objectives that is encouraging some critical examination and possible fundamental change to the way we do education. Now, transformation of education requires longer-term thinking. The way in which past trends define our choices in the present, but also how our actions in the present will impact longer-term futures. So I think the first point is to say that the Transforming Education Summit process, and despite the name that reflects the shift in language and global policy, had a hard time, I would say, actually addressing the question of transformation and reimagining and rethinking education because of this way this uneasy combination of short-term response to COVID, of get SDG 4 back on track, and then thirdly, these are very different mindsets and very different timeframes. The second explanation we could advance for the discrepancy, perhaps, between the discourse of transformation and the actual proposals resulting from the Transforming Education Summit is perhaps a failure to recognize that educational transformation requires wider social, economic, and political changes. And before turning to just a couple of examples from what we see in the national statements of commitment to transform education, just to recall perhaps the framing of the report of the International Commission on the Futures of Education. The framing, and I'm citing here, states, the future of humanity and the planet are at risk. We are faced with an existential choice: continue on an unsustainable path or radically change course. And this framing, this framing very much echoes the framing suggested by the UN Secretary General in our common agenda, who uses the terms, humanity faces a stark and urgent choice, a breakdown or a breakthrough. We're thus at a turning point and a historical juncture. But as we mentioned, pedagogies of hope, no trend is destiny, and there is reason for hope, and we can imagine and shape possible alternative futures. And education, and we of all as educators are convinced that education is key to changing course, that knowledge, learning, education are the basis for human development, but also the basis for transformation and the shaping of alternative futures. But we also recognize that the current state of education, our approaches and our models, our practices in their current format will not help us transform the future. And the dual challenge that the report of the Futures of Education presents, most discussions about the futures of education and the future is looking at the future. Changes, wider societal changes. Much of the more instrumental discourse is about education needing to adapt to these wider changes. And here, there is a first argument, there's a dual challenge that first of all, there is a rationale to rethink and transform education, even if we were not looking at the future. Just looking at our present and the past and the extent of persistent exclusion from education. The approximately 250 million children, we know the headline figures, out of school, the 770 million adults who are non-literate, now the estimated 70% of 10-year-olds who cannot read a simple text and understand it. The fact that half of upper secondary students, that's the world average, do not complete that level. So what is this model that we keep pushing that is not fully working for everyone? So that is reason enough to say we need to transform education, is actually addressing, and I would say repairing, the injustices and the exclusions of the past. So interestingly, in the national statements of commitment, some of these issues were brought up. But let's look at how they were brought up. On issues of inclusion, exclusion, the vast majority of these statements, over 130 countries, 87% of them, underscored the importance of ensuring more inclusive education systems that meet the needs of vulnerable learners and communities. Great, but there's very little in the way of the political actions needed to bring this about. It's striking, for example, that only 15% of these statements addressed inclusion or exclusion from the perspective of cultural or minority rights. No countries of these 133 in their statements submitted at the summit addressed the question of mother tongue instruction. And when we know the Global Education Monitoring Report in one of their policy briefs in 2016 estimated that as many as 40% of the global population do not have access to an education in a language that they speak or understand. The title of the policy brief was, "If you don't understand, how can you learn?" 40%. And yet here we are talking about transformation and trying to deal with our past exclusions, and the issue of language policy, language of instruction, which are political choices, which are political questions, is not addressed. Similarly, when talking about teachers, practically 95% of the statements underline the importance of pre- and service training, professional development training of teachers, but only a third brought up the questions of working conditions, of social status. Only 4 of the more than 130 national statements actually made commitments to salary increases. The issue of contract teachers mentioned by only a small handful. How can we transform education if we don't address these basic questions around the teaching profession? So that's on the futures of education. That's the first rationale really for saying, why do we need to transform, even without looking at the future? But then if we do look at the future, we also say, and look at the current trends, and they were mentioned earlier this morning, whether climate change, biodiversity loss, the polarization of our societies, etc., education can also be part of the problem. And to take one example, which is nicely quoted from the Futures of Education report concerning the environment. The world's most educated people, countries and people, are the ones most accelerating climate change. So if being educated means living unsustainably, we need to recalibrate our notions of what education should do and what it means to be educated. So again, for both of these reasons, whether we're looking, our present is 1 foot in the past and 1 foot in the future. And for both of these reasons, we need a longer term perspective, both looking back at what explains some of the root causes of social, economic, political, cultural exclusion, and looking at a longer term future. So yes, business as usual will not do. more of the same approaches to education will not do. We need a different education, and that's what transformation means. If we're really to transform education to shape more just, inclusive, sustainable futures, we have to acknowledge the inherently political nature of education. This longer-term view, looking back and looking ahead, a longer-term view that can reframe our actions in the present to change course, and actions that can contribute to the broader economic, social, political changes needed to realize a vision of sustainable development, one that's grounded in principles of social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. And we heard the term guided really by the principle of solidarity in our common humanity. This is what we stand for at UNESCO above all. So it's a combination, and I'll end with this, of political change at the system level, perhaps more top-down, but political changes that can support the right to education and protect education as a public endeavor and a common good. A top-down, perhaps whole-of-government approach, but that needs to be combined with a bottom-up, transformative, civic, social, and political engagement, which is supported by global/local citizenship education, one that can promote fundamental change, not only in how we think and view the world, but how we act individually and collectively. And the question to perhaps leave you with is encouraging social and civic action. What is the frontier between this and a more politicized form of action, whether it is to demand of decision makers or to actually create a movement of change? And we saw the question of research as a political act that Arjun Appadurai was referring to. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much again for this opportunity, just to share some thoughts at this very high level, I would say, in terms of looking at global education policy and looking at it from our work at UNESCO. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these inspiring words about the role of UNESCO in the process of reflecting global learning and taking it as a transformative power, let me say it like this, for fundamental changes, and to encourage us really to focus for global learning on minority rights, mother tongue, exclusion, inclusion, and all these important perspectives. The speech of you will be responded by Dr. Namrata Sharma. She is an adjunct professor at the State University of New York at Oswego. She's an expert in the United Nations Network on Harmony with Nature Knowledge. Namrata has specialist interests in global citizenship education and international and comparative education. In her ongoing research, she's engaged in drawing meaningful linkages between teaching the UNESCO-led initiatives of global citizenship education and education for sustainable development.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I very much enjoyed your talk. Dr. Tawil, thank you so much. It was really useful, very interesting, and very relevant, I think, for us as individuals. But today I want to talk a little bit, just in a few minutes that are allocated to me to respond to this fantastic speech. To respond in terms of not only how we can take some of these UNESCO initiatives forward as individuals, but also collectively as part of the Angel Network, as members of the Angel Network. So I think that the UNESCO initiatives, including, the Futures of Education initiative and the role of the Angel Network in terms of the importance of educational research in taking forward UNESCO's plans as heard today, are closely intertwined. Both Angel and UNESCO are, among other agencies, are instrumental in shaping the future of education, the initiatives to foster innovative approaches to learning worldwide. So the UNESCO Futures of Education initiative and others outlined by Dr. Tawil today demonstrate the need for the transformation of education as well as for transformative education to respond to a rapidly evolving world. By emphasizing key skills, inclusivity, and lifelong learning, these UNESCO initiatives provide a comprehensive framework, not just to get education back on track after the global pandemic, which I think are really important. And the 3 points elucidated today, I think are going to be very helpful for me, but also moving beyond, just getting education back on track to reimagining education and the conversations needed for a new social contract for education, as outlined by the 2021 report. This report, the Futures of Education report, recognizes the importance of equipping learners with the competencies required to thrive in an increasingly complex, interconnected, and interdependent global society, aiming at 2050 and beyond. But I think here, the Angel Network's role in supporting the UNESCO's Future of Education initiative, but also other work through research and development as key components are really crucial. Research can help identify within UNESCO's framework what are the emerging technologies, pedagogical methods, assessment practices, and policies that have the potential to enhance learning outcomes and support the needs of learners across diverse contexts, as well as helping address the particularities of teachers, educational institutions, and learning communities, language as well being a big barrier across the world, certainly from India, where I come from. So how does, Angel research or Angel Network researchers contribute to widening these gaps? And in this context, I think both the keynotes heard today are particularly, merit deep consideration. So drawing from such Angel research into UNESCO's plans in a more strategic way through a well-designed and well-informed collaborative and dialogic process, I think can help contribute to shaping education policies and frameworks that align with the UNESCO initiatives, such as the collaboration taking place between the Angel Network and Global Education Network Europe, or GENE. In this way, hopefully this seminar will be a kickstart to Angel and UNESCO too working very closely with each other, such as Angel and GENE have been in the more recent past. The Angel Network can provide policymakers worldwide who are looking to implement UNESCO's plans within their own national education systems with the necessary support, evidence, and advice that comes from peer-reviewed scientific research drawn from across the world. The Global Education Digest, which we will hear more of from Professor Tarosi in his keynote shortly, is Angel's bibliography of academic and research materials, latest one published in 2022, that has been drawing from research across a number of languages, from its first to fifth edition. As this digest suggests and showcases, and also can be seen through the various Angel publications and seminars, there is an increasing body of work on various strands of global education, including a reflection of voices from marginalized and less widely known perspectives, as well as evidence-based research coming from Angel on the impact of local and global issues on learning and teaching across formal and non-formal education. For example, the impact of digital revolution, COVID-19 emergency, and the climate change crisis. So in conclusion, the UNESCO aims and initiatives as outlined by Professor Dr. Tawil today and the work of the Angel Network, I think, are closely intertwined. The UNESCO Futures of Education initiative in particular provides a vision and a framework for transforming education, while the Angel Academic Network can facilitate collaboration, research, professional development, and capacity building to support and advance the goals of this framework and initiative. So together, I think Angel and UNESCO have the potential to drive meaningful change in education and create a future in which learning is innovative, empowering, as well as inclusive. And I hope that this conference, again, can help strengthen such collaboration. So with that, I hope you enjoy the rest of this conference and, of course, this beautiful city. Thank you so much.